In June of 2013, my husband Michael and I had envisioned a serene week at our old family farmhouse in rural Maine. It was meant to be the ideal escape, a moment for our family to rejuvenate away from the hustle and bustle of the city. However, Michael, serving the U.S. Army, was unable to secure leave at the last moment. Rather than abandon our plans, I chose to proceed with our two children, Emily, who was 10, and Jacob, who was 8. The farmhouse, nestled a few miles outside of Ellsworth, is enveloped by acres of wild fields, a rustic structure built in the late 1940s. My grandfather's place has always offered a sense of solace, with its creaky porch and the aroma of aged wood. At times, it can feel quite remote. The cell reception is unreliable, and the security is just basic locks on the doors and windows. We arrived on a bright afternoon, and the kids eagerly raced around, thrilled to explore the orchard and the little flower garden in the back. Everything felt just right that first day. I unpacked the groceries, checked the plumbing, and experienced a gentle wave of relief, even in Michael's absence. I felt content to share this corner of my childhood with Emily and Jacob. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee. I noticed something odd. The old deck chair near the railing wasn't where it had been. It looked like it had been pulled halfway across the porch. My first thought was that the kids had moved it, but when I asked them, they both insisted they hadn't touched it. Later that day, I also realized a small garden statue, a weathered gnome, had shifted several inches from its usual spot. Little details, but enough to make me uneasy. With no cameras or alarms in sight, my options were limited. I meticulously checked the locks and resolved to stay vigilant. I attempted to mask my unease, yet my thoughts kept returning to the peculiar act of shifting a deck chair or a garden statue. Such a triviality. That afternoon, Emily and Jacob were playing tag near the bushes bordering the backyard fence. While I was inside washing dishes, I suddenly heard Jacob's yell. I dashed outside, bracing for a scraped knee or a bee sting, but instead found both kids looking visibly shaken. Jacob leaned in and murmured about a figure in a white mask lurking behind the foliage. Emily acknowledged his words, noting how the man had crouched low upon being seen. I rushed to the fence, but the area was empty. I made an effort to remain composed. There were a few neighbors along the nearby road. Perhaps one had wandered onto our property for some strange reason. I informed the kids that we would remain indoors for the remainder of the day, just to be cautious. Night fell without any further events. We secured the doors and settled in the living room. The three of us nestled together. The pull-out sofa, with every creak echoing through the house, had my nerves frayed. Yet, aside from my own restless thoughts, nothing else transpired. The next morning, I spotted footprints in the soft dirt beside the farmhouse. It appeared someone had circled the entire building, and my heart raced with the unsettling realization that this was no mere figment of my imagination. Someone had clearly been wandering the property overnight. The rest of the day was spent in a state of heightened alertness, every rustle igniting my suspicion. That evening, after tucking Emily and Jacob into bed, I gazed out the window toward the garden. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed a tall figure standing near the gnome statue, partially obscured by the shrubs. The figure remained still, as if examining the house. I froze, unsure of what to do next. Then, he turned his head in my direction. Even from afar, I felt the weight of his gaze. It was fleeting. The moment he spotted me, he bolted, racing across the yard and vanishing into the same line of bushes where the kids had seen him. Early the next morning, I reached out to the local police department. An officer named Benson arrived within the hour. He searched the property, looking for footprints or signs of forced entry, but found nothing definitive. It was both frustrating and somewhat embarrassing to explain, as aside from some moved objects and footprints, we lacked concrete evidence to identify the culprit. The remainder of our stay unfolded uneventfully. Whoever that masked figure was, he never returned. Perhaps our call had deterred him. After the encounter with the police, he felt a sense of unease. Emily and Jacob shared that tension. But as time passed, We made an effort to concentrate on the brighter sides of our trip. Yet, I found it hard to let my guard down. Each night, I would sit by the window, watching the yard for any signs of life. When our vacation came to an end, we drove back, feeling a sense of relief at returning to the hustle and bustle of familiar streets and neighbors. I confided in Michael about everything, but without any evidence. There was little we could do except move forward. Sometimes, I still ponder who that man was and what his intentions were as he lurked around. Our farmhouse, nestled in the middle of nowhere, stirs a part of me that worries he might have done the same to others' homes. Perhaps just observing, perhaps plotting something more sinister. I was 19 then, working the late shift at a small gas station on the outskirts of Redfield, about 30 minutes from my home. My schedule typically ran from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. Most nights, I found myself sipping cold coffee, fighting off sleep at the register, and wishing for a calm shift without any surprises. When I first started, the area was pretty quiet, and I convinced myself it would be a straightforward job, just ringing up drinks and snacks, maybe assisting someone with gas if they looked lost. Easy money, I thought. I still recall the first time I encountered the old man. It was a Tuesday night in early November, just another typical shift, nothing unusual. He walked in around 2 a.m., dressed in a neatly pressed flannel, with a clean shirt, jeans, and a small newspaper tucked under his arm. His voice cracked softly as he mumbled a good evening. There was something disarming about him. Perhaps it was the friendly, grandfatherly aura he exuded. He brought a black coffee, thanked me with a warm smile, and headed out. It seemed like no big deal at first, but he began returning night after night, usually around the same time. Eventually, I found myself preparing his coffee before he even had to ask. To be honest, I looked forward to seeing him. Working that shift felt lonely, and his presence brightened it. Longed for connection, seeking any form of dialogue to fill the time. He introduced himself as Martin, omitting a last name, and I didn't inquire further. It was refreshing to share a bit of camaraderie. Over the next week, our conversations deepened, remaining casual. We discussed local news, the weather, and the approaching holidays. Occasionally, he would inquire about the station, how many employees were there, whether we had cameras inside, and if we kept a significant amount of cash in the register at night. Initially, I brushed it off. After all, people often have their curiosities. It was intriguing, particularly among the older crowd, and I had heard that lonely retirees often linger at gas stations or small diners just for a chat. Yet, I couldn't shake the oddity of how he persistently redirected our conversation to store procedures on November 10th at around 3 a.m. He arrived with his familiar smile, coffee in hand, casually leaning against the counter. He inquired if I felt secure working by myself. I shrugged it off, assuring him that I did. We have a solid security system, and we never keep more than a few hundred in the register at once. I even shared details about 7:55, our manager, Don, would occasionally make unexpected visits. Martin listened intently, tilting his head and giving a thoughtful nod before shifting the conversation. A few nights later, a couple of local officers entered. I didn't recognize them, but they appeared tense. When asked if I had noticed any suspicious activity in the area, I hesitated for a moment, recalling Martin's strangely detailed inquiries. But I assured the officers I hadn't seen anything unusual, just the usual regulars and familiar night owls. They departed quickly, without further discussion. After making a purchase, an odd sensation settled in my stomach, but I reassured myself that I was merely overreacting. Martin continued to drop by, and our conversations flowed. By mid-November, I had inadvertently revealed numerous details: how the security cameras occasionally malfunctioned, how I was the sole key holder for the supply room at night, and even my usual routine for counting the drawer. It may sound foolish now, but at the time, I was simply thrilled to have someone to talk to. He never came across as threatening or insistent. He merely nodded and posed casual follow-up questions, as if he were genuinely interested. On November 19th, I recall a peculiar tension hanging in the air. The parking lot was eerily silent, and the overhead lights appeared dimmer than normal. Martin was late, which stirred a sense of unease within me. I attempted to dismiss it, yet that unsettling stillness persisted as the clock struck 4 a.m. No customers had entered for nearly 2 hours, which was unusual even for our slow days. I stepped away from the counter to restock some sodas when I heard it, a loud crash from the back of the store. My heart raced, and I half expected Martin to jump out from behind something. The shelves loomed ominously, casting shadows that danced in the dim light. The door stood ajar, and a few boxes lay scattered on the floor. Initially, I dismissed it as a mere mishap, but then I caught sight of 2 figures, their faces obscured by ski masks, darting through the storage area. One clutched a duffel bag, while the other brandished what appeared to be a pistol. They were oblivious to my presence, so I crouched behind the aisle, straining to keep my breath steady. My thoughts raced. Where was Martin? Was he here as well? After what felt like an eternity, I heard their hurried footsteps retreating through the back door. I remained frozen,